Thank you for listening to the Well-Read Christian Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Stanley, and today we begin taking a look at the modern classic dystopian novel, 1984. Although published 73 years ago, this modern classic has been hugely impactful in the way that we think about totalitarianism, collectivist ideologies such as communism and fascism, and other dystopian futures. In today's episode, I want to tell you the story of 1984 as if you had never read it, so that if you haven't actually read it, you can walk away knowing the story and its significance. For those who have read it, you can get a succinct summary of the main and important points, as well as my favorite ones. Next episode, we'll discuss the major elements and discuss their relevance to today. Totalitarian governments appear to be growing on the world stage, and the governments of the West continue to slide towards totalitarianism. So this is kind of a dreadful topic to discuss. But if you stick with me, I'll make sure to end the series with an encouraging thought that politics is not ultimately a place to find security and hope. Trying to fix the world by tinkering with politics is a fool's game, and while we do need to maintain stable and good political institutions, we should never see political solutions as a means or prerequisite for happiness. Even in the real-life dystopian North Korea, Christian hope thrives. God uses the severe oppression in China and other places to mold and draw his people closer to himself, which is the real source of true and enduring happiness. Thank you again for listening to the Well-Read Christian Podcast. If you enjoy our show, please like our Facebook page and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Facebook Recommends. A positive comment and a 5-star submission is a huge boost for the big tech algorithms. You can also subscribe on YouTube, where you'll find our full catalog of previous episodes. It's really special to see your feedback, and I sincerely appreciate that you might take 2 or 3 minutes to help me out. Finally, if you've benefited from the podcast or believe in our mission, you're welcome to make a tax-deductible donation to support our work on our website, wellreadchristian.com. 1984 is a work by Eric Blair, better known by his pen name, George Orwell. Published in 1949, the book is his most prominent and influential work against totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is any form of government that has its roots in every aspect of life. Under totalitarianism, the government has real, regulative control over your religious beliefs, your education, your entertainment, news, employment, industry, travel, everything, you name it. The opposite of totalitarianism is anarchy. Real-world examples of totalitarianism include Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, which Orwell had specifically in mind when he wrote 1984. George Orwell also wrote Animal Farm, which some consider to be a better work than 1984, since it's shorter and a little more to the point. But I like 1984 because I think the iconic Orwellian vocabulary and warnings are particularly relevant, and its more mature themes and direct social commentary make it harder to brush aside. The value of 1984 is not to scare you into thinking that the government is always out to get you. Instead, the reason I think it's important to look at this book and be familiar with it is because it gets a lot right. People who are drawn into collectivist ideologies, people who are drawn into communism and fascism, they're under the effects of the postmodern age that we've been talking about for the past 45 episodes. Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, Solzhenitsyn, all of them are talking about this existential vacuum of meaning that is left in the wake of the death of God. 1984 does an excellent job at illustrating where that goes in certain concrete political terms. And in fact, a lot of Orwell's predictions about the surveillance state end up being spot on in places like Xi Jinping's China. So Orwell is important to study because he gets a lot right. Another example is that he gets tyrants right. In the postmodern age, tyrants believe that they are doing a good thing. They believe that they are a savior to humanity by restricting the freedoms of their citizens. Tyrants believe that people are helpless, pathetic morons who crave meaning and easy answers, and they give them those things at the cost of their freedom. And one of the things that I want you to be thinking about is the fact that tyrants are not just the one guy who happens to be in charge of everything. There are also aspiring tyrants who want other people's freedoms restricted because they believe that if only I had a little bit more power and you guys would all just shut up for a second and let me run things, you would see that everything is better. You would see that my ideas, even though they restrict your freedom, they lead to a better world. That's just a wannabe tyrant. That's a tyrant who just doesn't have any power. One of the things that I hope you see is that the things that Orwell gets right are not just about politics. It's also about how people behave and think following a postmodern worldview, following the death of God. And so as I summarize the book and draw out its major scenes and things, I want you to be thinking in terms of not only politics, but also human beings. Okay, on to the summary. The book is set in London, but a future version of London. Remember, when this was written, 1984 was several decades in the future. And in this hypothetical future, Orwell imagines that all nations, cultures, history, and race have been assimilated into 3 massive superstates that are constantly at war. The story focuses on one man named Winston Smith. Winston works for the Ministry of Truth, which is a government institution in charge of propaganda and censorship. He works as a rectifier, which means that his job is to go through historical records and either change them to conform to what the party says, or to simply destroy them. This turns out to be a prominent theme in 1984, because the party changes its mind a lot, and since Winston personally destroys all the records, he realizes that the only thing that can capture true history is memory. But then again, memory is fickle. It can be forgotten or mischaracterized, brainwashed, or simply lost to time. Like a child who is learning about object permanence, Winston realizes that history is a thing that can be destroyed, as long as no one's looking. And even though people have memories, they can be gaslit into misremembering. And if the past is destroyed and people misremember, then what's the difference between it never existing at all? Gaslighting, by the way, is when someone manipulates you into thinking that your memory about a certain event or whatever is wrong and that their version of events is right. This is a major part of Winston's job, and he is terrified at how easy it is. Of course, a big reason why it's so easy is because he has special access and permission to destroy all physical documents and objects that attest to the past, or at least the past that the party wants destroyed. Sometimes the Ministry of Truth gaslights people about simple things. For example, everyone cheers when it's announced that chocolate rations will go up for everyone. But it seems as though Winston is the only one who remembers just last week when chocolate rations went down. That means that we're only breaking even. Alongside the Ministry of Truth, there's the Ministry of Plenty, whose job it is to manage the farms and rations. They always report more growth every quarter, even though much of the time they're actually cutting the rations. There's also the Ministry of Peace, which is the engine behind the endless wars with the other 2 superstates. And finally, there's the Ministry of Love, whose task it is to monitor the population, identify thought criminals and other forms of dissent, and imprison and torture them until they are twisted into believing that Big Brother is watching and is always looking out for your best interests. Big Brother, as I'm sure you're aware, is the symbol of the government in 1984. Big Brother is the leader of Oceania, the savior of the people, and the stand-in for the intense cult of personality that often surrounds totalitarian states. Posters are hung in every house that remind you Big Brother is watching. And that is, of course, literally true in 1984. In every house, there's a television set that has government programs running all day, and installed are cameras where all citizens are monitored by the government around the clock. The book opens with Winston alone in his apartment in former London. Although he's always being monitored, Winston considers himself lucky because he has an end unit in his complex, which means there's a small corner which is inaccessible to the camera. This is where Winston carries out a crime punishable by death, keeping a diary. Oh yes, keeping a diary is very dangerous, you see, because in it you can do such things as document the past, be honest about your feelings, even if only to yourself, and of course, express thoughts that are contrary to the state. Winston knows that it is inevitable that he will be caught for his crimes. It's only a matter of time. In fact, his thoughts are interrupted when there's a knock on the door. He holds his breath and opens it. But it's only his neighbor's wife, Mrs. Parsons. She's asking for help unclogging the sink. He sighs from relief and happily obliges to help her. Her children circle Winston when he approaches the kitchen, as they chant their favorite insults. They call him a traitor, a thought criminal, and worst of all, they call him Goldstein. Ah, Goldstein. Goldstein is the face of evil in Oceania. He is the face of rebellion against Big Brother, and he is universally hated by everyone. Every day, party members gather to spew hateful and angry filth at Goldstein, blaming him for all of their problems and all of their worries. Many of the things in 1984 are reflections of actual historical accounts from totalitarian countries. You may recall my series on Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, where the author recounts how normal it was for the press to simply blame everything on the counter-revolutionaries. Anything that's bad that's happening in the country, it's the right-wing wreckers who are just sabotaging everything and making sure that we don't have our pinnacle happiness. And so, the same thing is here in 1984. All of the hatred is channeled into Goldstein. The bitterness and envy of all the people are put into public enemy number one, which is really useful for the elite to maintain their power. After the children have their fun pretending to denounce someone as a traitor, Winston unclogs the sink and returns home. The next day, Winston is at work, and a coworker is boasting at lunch about newspeak. It's the future of the English language, he insists. But unlike every other language, which gradually adds new words to the lexicon, with newspeak, words are changed or simply deleted. This is an important step in the evolution of language, he explains, because without words to express thoughts, those thoughts will simply cease to exist. The party wants to control language, because by controlling language, they can control thoughts. Oh, how much easier it will be to stop thought criminals when they won't even have language to express their wrong opinions. Another thing we, the reader, learn about is a concept called doublespeak. Doublespeak is the ability to espouse and affirm two contradictory ideas at once without bothering to question their inconsistency. This point is actually worth quoting. It will give you a feel for the book, too. When explaining what doublespeak is, then the narrator says, quote, "To know and not to know, to be conscious of complete truthfulness while telling carefully constructed lies, to hold simultaneously two opinions which cancel out, knowing them to be contradictory and believing in both of them, to use logic against logic, to repudiate morality while laying claim to it, to believe that democracy was impossible and that the party was the guardian of democracy, to forget whatever it was necessary to forget, and then to draw it back into memory again at the moment when it becomes expedient or needed, and then promptly to forget it again, and then above all, to apply the same process to the process itself. That was the ultimate subtlety. Consciously to induce unconsciousness, and then, once again, to become unconscious of the act of hypnosis you had just performed. Even to understand the word doublethink involved the use of doublethink." End quote. The party's three slogans are great examples of doublespeak. Slavery is freedom, war is peace, and ignorance is strength. If you think about it, it almost sounds profound. Ignorance is strength, slavery is freedom, war is peace. I love Orwell's use of the Soviet stance on democracy in his example. The Soviets used to say that democracy is impossible and it's undesirable. But then they would also say that Soviet Russia is the ultimate guardian of democracy, that they have the ultimate democracy. After observing this insanity day after day, Winston writes this in his diary. "Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. If that is granted, all else follows. Man, I love that. That is so powerful. Winston says, freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. If that is granted, all else follows. That is exactly right. If people are allowed to speak the truth unabashedly, then people can act on the truth. And the truth is a great place to build civilization. As soon as we all collectively agree to lie about something, anything, that's when doublethink can sink in. And power games start to be played. And shame and fear and gaslighting manipulate people toward hate and violence and collectivism. The first few chapters go on like this, with Orwell explaining the dystopia and making his social commentary. And before I go on describing kind of the next major section of the book, I have to say that sex and romance play an interesting part in 1984. Winston goes to visit the proletariat, who are about 70% of the population, and they're called the proletariat because that's a word for the working class. And these average, ordinary, lower-class folk are not as closely monitored as everyone else. They don't have a screen in every room. And they do most of the manual labor in Oceania. While Winston is visiting the proles, as they are called, the proletariat, the proles, he visits an elderly prostitute. And the reason is because romantic love is banned by the party. Marriages are only tolerated to bear children, who are then considered property of the state. The family unit is completely abolished in 1984. Therefore, one of the main acts of rebellion that Winston's going to engage in the central part of the story, is that he's going to fall in love. Of course, I'm not suggesting that he intentionally falls in love in order to rebel. It's just that he is a human being in an inhuman world. The story of 1984 is the story of how Winston falls in love with this girl, with whom they develop elaborate plans to evade detection so that they can secretly share passionate lovemaking. And you might think that that's kind of weird. You know, wouldn't they also talk about things on an emotional level and stuff like that? And they do a little bit, but there's really not much to say. Sure, it's nice that they can be themselves when they eventually have these, small hours at a time where they can both sneak off and things. But there's not a whole lot to talk about. They don't talk about art because there is no art. They don't talk about sports because there are no sports. There's nothing in Oceania that makes them human. And so all there is left is lovemaking as an act of rebellion. And I think Orwell uses romance in 1984 as a symbol of rebellion against a state that wants to turn people into economic pawns. I think for Orwell, sex between people who truly love each other is a powerful expression of humanity. Another potential answer to the question of why lovemaking, Orwell, that's kind of weird. Well, the government controls people in 1984 through fear and shame. So when Winston meets Julia, they share something that completely banishes fear or shame, namely physical intimacy. And so that's one more reason why lovemaking is the ultimate act of rebellion in 1984. Anyway, Winston spends some time in the slightly more free place of the Poles at this point of the story. He spends some time with the Poles, the proletariat, and these simpletons do simple work for simple pay. And although they outnumber the party 20-1, they're not sophisticated enough to recognize their strength, and so they squander it. For Orwell, this represents the inevitable truth that the ruling class is always a small minority who are completely dependent on the lower class. If only the lower class would recognize their power and use it effectively, then there would never be tyranny. At least, that's Orwell's claim. There's an interesting scene, perhaps my favorite, certainly my favorite. And the reason it's my favorite is because I can't quite figure its meaning, and I want to tell you about it. There's this scene where Winston is having an existential crisis about the past. This is a major theme in 1984, and so he's hanging around the proletariat, and he's thinking about the nature of the past, and so it dawns on him that he remembers details about the past that don't line up with the official narrative. And people who are older than him might be able to corroborate those details. And so he goes to a bar and he finds this old man. And after seeing him, he thinks, aha, I got it. Surely he remembers what life was like before the party. Since in the story, the party had only been in power for a handful of decades. And so Winston goes to this man and he begins asking him questions about the past. He asks, what was it like when you were a child? How did the party come to power? What was the revolution like? What was it like under capitalist rule? And the old man has nothing to say to him. All he can remember are trivial details. He keeps getting sidetracked and talking about how beer used to be cheaper. He can't stay on topic, and he certainly has nothing useful to say. Winston keeps asking him questions like, did the rich ever treat you like you were less than a human being? Did they force you to tip your hat or else they would beat you up? And the old man would say things like, well, yeah, I mean, it was polite to tip your hat. You know, they wore these fancy top hats, you see, the capitalists did, and they didn't like it if you didn't tip your hat back at them if they said hello. And Winston, is pressing him like, but would you be beaten for disobeying the orders of a capitalist? And the old man would think for a second and, ask for another drink, and he'd get distracted a couple times, and then he'd go, there was this one time that I got beat up in an alleyway, and on and on. And eventually, Winston is exasperated, and so he just gives up. And there are more details that I'm glossing over, and I'm sure the poetry of what I'm trying to communicate is not getting through. But this is my favorite part of the book. Maybe it's a warning. Most of the book seems to be a warning. It could be a lesson, a call to young men to focus on becoming a certain kind of old man. Maybe Orwell is warning people against becoming useless elders who are only concerned with trivialities, who don't understand the world around them, who have gotten older but have not gotten wiser. That's how I took it at first. It almost felt like Orwell was shaking me and saying, don't be so fixated on beer and gas prices that you lose track of the larger world. Your grandchildren will need your wisdom, and it's your job to make sure that you are an elder worth listening to when you become an elder. But now I wonder if Orwell is actually saying something far more pessimistic. Maybe he's actually saying that the majority of ordinary people just don't have it in them to understand the world. Throughout this whole chapter, Winston has been telling himself over and over again that if change is ever to come, it has to come through the proles. They outnumber the party 20-1, and it's their labor that even makes society possible. But when any single one of them step back to see the world as a whole, and they see that it's heading in the wrong direction, they're overwhelmed by it, and they prefer to just live in the trivialities rather than resist the tide. Maybe Orwell is saying that because people see themselves as a single useless cog, it will always be easier to just grow old and complain rather than resist the tide. We see this massive tidal wave and we're overwhelmed by it, and so we just turn away. And that turning away by ordinary people is inevitable, and it's the reason why future generations will never know what the past was really like. And it's the reason that wisdom will not actually be passed from one generation to the next. Anyway, time skip in the book. He has this conversation, he moves on, he goes back to work, boy meets girl, they fall in love, they go frolic and do fun things alone in rebellion. And so part 3 finally picks up where Winston and his paramour, Julia, think that they have actually found a representative of the Brotherhood. And the Brotherhood is the secret rebels who are waging a secret war against the party. Of course, their fearless leader is Goldstein. So the book picks up where a coworker of Winston, his supervisor, his name is O'Brien, has seemed to hint towards him that he is an ally. Subtle looks, particular conversation topics, and unnoticeable voice intonations has indicated that he's an ally and that he can be trusted. And so now he invites Winston over to his house, and him and Julia are convinced that this is their ticket into the real resistance. Of course, they know the risks are huge, and they discuss one night that even if they are captured, their love for each other will never change. Confessions under torture don't mean anything. They can make you confess, but they can't make you believe your confession. They can never get to the real you, the you that's on the inside. When Winston and Julia go to O'Brien's house, he reveals that he has had his eye on them for some time. He knows the facade that they put up for the party, and he is ready to accept them into the Brotherhood. But before he gives them the book that will explain everything, he asks them to swear loyalty to the Brotherhood and to Goldstein. He asks that they swear to do anything that they're asked, as long as it's in the service of the resistance. They promise to give their lives. They promise to kill. They promise to commit acts of sabotage that will cause the deaths of hundreds of innocent people. They promise to betray their country to foreign powers, to cheat, blackmail, propagandize, spread disease, or do all kinds of terrible things, even to innocent people, if it means weakening the party. They even agree to giving up their own identities entirely, having their faces changed, their voices changed, their entire body changed, if they may need to transform themselves for better subterfuge. They agree to all of it. The only thing they do not agree to is to not ever seeing each other again. Both Winston and Julia say that their love is more important than even bringing down the party. O'Brien finds this acceptable. He says, "Thank you for telling me everything." And he gives them the book. This book was written by Goldstein, the highest member of the Brotherhood, and the face of evil that they've been trained to hate for all of these years. They accept this book, and they return to a small room that they've been renting out in the Prole district. Later that night, the two are reading the book together and feeling truly optimistic about the future for the first time in their lives. As a reader of the book, you are really excited for them. It really seems like, wow, they just joined the Brotherhood. Maybe things really will change. They've made their little nook into a place that they call home. A painting of a church hangs over their bedpost. They have trinkets and knickknacks on the desk. They've gotten more comfortable with each other. They're able to talk about anything they want without cameras spying on them at every moment. Or so they think. After falling asleep together, they are rudely awakened by their door being busted down and the thought police swarming in from every angle. It turns out that the owner of the store that they had been renting a room from is actually a member of the secret police. There has been a hidden camera in the church painting all along. Even a painted representation of the sacred turns out to be a betrayer. In the final part of the book, Winston finds himself deep in a cell underground in the Ministry of Love. He shares a cellmate with an older woman. As they talk, he mentions that his name is Smith, and she mentions that her surname is also Smith. She could be his mother, but there's no way to know. 20 years of hard labor change a person, and familial bonds aren't encouraged by the party. This is perfectly illustrated by the next prisoner who's thrown into the cell, Mr. Parsons, one of Winston's co-workers in the Ministry of Truth. Winston is flabbergasted by this because Mr. Parsons was always a top supporter of the party. He was a true believer, but apparently he was denounced by one of his children. So Winston is clarifying to Mr. Parsons, "What, you were always a true believer. Does that mean you're actually guilty? You were faking it all along?" And Parsons says, "Of course I'm guilty. Do you think the party would have made a mistake?" Even though Parsons is actually innocent, he believes that he's guilty because the party has arrested him. That's how much faith he's placed in the party. He explains how he must have uttered an unorthodox thought in his sleep. He doesn't remember it, of course, but he's thankful that they caught him so that he could be corrected and released, hopefully after only 5 years of hard labor, maybe 10. After some more experiences which reflect communist justice systems, eventually O'Brien enters the cell. At first, Winston thinks that he's been caught too, but soon he realizes that O'Brien has betrayed him. O'Brien reveals that he's been watching him and Julia all along, the entire time. Winston assumes that they're going to torture and eventually kill him, and they do torture him. But O'Brien explains that the Ministry of Love is very careful not to create martyrs. O'Brien explains that the Spanish Inquisition failed to maintain power because each heretic they killed inspired 1,000 more. Taking people to burn at the stake put fear in the hearts of the simple, but it also put courage in the hearts of the sympathizers. Then he says that the Russian Soviets thought that they learned from this mistake. The Russian Soviets were careful to make sure to degrade and humiliate all their detractors before killing them. It's not enough to merely torture them. You have to make them beg for death. They have to be sniveling, quivering, starved shells of their former self, always isolated, always naked. Then you make them confess to crimes that they didn't commit. You make them betray their loved ones by denouncing them too. You make them lose everything that they once held dear, and then you kill them. But, O'Brien explains, even this eventually wears off. After you eventually kill them, their degradation fades, and they're still seen as victims. What the party does that is truly the final evolution of the means to keep power is this. The party does not create martyrs. It creates converts. O'Brien explains to Winston that he will never die, nor leave the Ministry of Love until he truly loves Big Brother. And O'Brien assures Winston that he will love Big Brother. Winston still can't quite understand what that could mean. Surely, you can always offer a fake confession. You can always offer a fake betrayal of Julia or your loved ones, but they can't really get inside of your head, right? They can't force you to love something that you really hate. They can't force you to deny the obvious truths that you see, even in your own mind. Even if they could make you say something, they can't actually control your thoughts. But while enduring grueling torture over the next several days and weeks and months, with O'Brien there at every moment, supervising the process and deciding exactly how much pain is inflicted and exactly how much is spared, Winston begins to develop a kind of Stockholm Syndrome for O'Brien. Deprived of all human interaction and affection, Winston grows to see O'Brien as a savior of sorts. Sure, O'Brien is in charge of inflicting pain, but he's also in charge of alleviating the pain, which he often does. I think this aspect of the final chapters is Orwell's way of imparting the old legend about Stalin. There is a legend that one of Stalin's top advisors asked him how he was able to maintain the love and affection of the people, despite the fact that he was a brutal menace. The story goes that Stalin stared blankly at the man before ordering a live chicken be fetched. He then took the chicken, put it under his arm, and began ripping out its feathers while the chicken screeched and struggled. And then Stalin let the chicken go. And while it was bleeding and stammering, he offered it some food right out of his hand. And the chicken approached and began eating, right from his palm. He then says something to the effect that the people will always follow you if they believe you are the only source of salvation, no matter how much pain you also inflict. Similarly, because O'Brien is stopping the torture as often as he's starting it, Winston begins to see him as the giver and taker of pain and pleasure, food and starvation. One of the aspects of this chapter is that O'Brien and Winston are constantly in this dialogue, in this debate about the nature of reality. And O'Brien is always so confident, so sure of himself, so stable in his answers. And Winston, he doesn't know what he thinks anymore. I mean, Of course, he believes that the past is real and 2 plus 2 makes 4 and all these things, but can he really be sure? I mean, after all, why trust your own perceptions when this person here is so confident? That's the analogy or allegory, perhaps, that Orwell is trying to draw our attention to. When someone, especially someone with authority, is in charge of so much and doing so much good as well as so much harm, we can begin to doubt our own perceptions and decide to just accept that of the official narrative. Perhaps Orwell is also saying that a government that has the exclusive power to feed also has the exclusive power to starve. Anyway, as Winston is suffering away, O'Brien and he have a discussion about the nature of the past. And this is kind of important. O'Brien is making him question whether the past really exists. Does the past exist? O'Brien says no. The past is just a relic of human memory. As soon as memory is distorted and the testifying objects are destroyed, the past can be anything you want it to be. He confidently declares that he who controls the present controls the past, and he who controls the past controls the future. This gives the party total control over all reality, past, present, and future. This should be reminiscent of the Communist Revolution in China, where priceless artifacts of Chinese history were destroyed in order to inspire more loyalty to the government and optimism for the great leap forward. Winston also asks O'Brien if Big Brother actually exists, to which O'Brien says, of course he exists. So Winston clarifies his question. Does he exist just like I exist, with a body, with a beginning and an end? And O'Brien retorts to Winston that he doesn't exist, that he has no beginning except what the party says, and he will end precisely when the party says, and when he has ended, the party will write him out of existence, such that he never existed at all. O'Brien says that all human beings are mere cells in the organism that is Big Brother. We are all a part of something larger, and when individuals die, it is no different than Big Brother trimming his fingernails. That is why Winston must learn to love Big Brother. At this point, Winston sees that O'Brien really does believe everything that he says. O'Brien says that human beings must choose between freedom and happiness, and that the party exists to make sure that people can choose happiness. O'Brien actually believes that the party is a sacred few who are giving up their happiness in order to make sure that the rest of humanity can live comfortably without having to struggle through the existential questions brought by freedom. C.S. Lewis once observed that the worst kind of tyrant is the one who truly believes that he tortures and kills for the good of the people. The worst kind of tyrant is one who really believes that he tyrannizes for the greater good. O'Brien tells Winston that he is the last remaining human being who believes in freedom, who has the human spirit. And once he dies, he'll be vaporized, turned to dust, and used to feed the crops. But first, the human spirit must be broken. He must learn to love Big Brother, to crave simplicity and unity that comes from accepting that he is but one of a larger organism in human existence. He must give up his narrow-minded notions about truth. He must stop seeing things the way they appear to him. He must accept that his perception is off, that he is a lunatic, and he must learn to see things the way everyone else sees them. He must learn that sometimes 2 plus 2 makes 5. After all, why should you be so confident in your own perceptions and your own ideas? You must understand that true freedom is slavery. Winston continues to slowly give way until he has learned that he is no longer able to care about simple truths. Perhaps freedom really is slavery. Perhaps war really is peace. Perhaps ignorance really is strength. He has been reduced to a mere animal-like existence. But still, he has one last thing that makes him human. He still has not betrayed Julia. O'Brien smiles seeing that Winston is still holding on to one last thing that makes him human: his love for Julia. And so, O'Brien takes him to the darkest, most terrible room in the Ministry of Love, Room 101. And in Room 101, they bring out whatever your worst fear is. Once Winston is there, he's strapped to a new chair. O'Brien explains that this is the hardest room to maintain, since everyone's greatest fears are different. Some people are terrified of being burned alive, others of impaled, others of burning alive, others of drowning. Some people are terrified of things that aren't even fatal or physically harmful. But Winston? Winston's greatest fear is rats. And so they strap a contraption to his face. O'Brien calmly begins explaining the history of this contraption, how it was used in Imperial China as a torture mechanism and an execution mechanism, where ravenous, rabid rats are going to come through this cage and begin burrowing through his face. Winston begins to tremble. He is terrified. Winston begs O'Brien, telling him that he will do anything. "Just tell me what to do, and I'll do it. What do I have to do?" begs Winston. "Just don't let those rats eat my face." O'Brien doesn't tell Winston what he wants him to do, which infuriates Winston. O'Brien continues to tantalize him, telling him about all the horrors that rats can do to a living person. He opens the doors to the rat cage, one at a time, letting the rats get ever closer. Suddenly, Winston begins crying and screaming, "Do it to Julia! Don't do it to me! Do it to Julia!" And he means it. He truly would wish 1,000 times worse things to happen to Julia if it would spare him this torture. And with that, O'Brien stops, and Winston is spared, because he has truly betrayed the last part of his human spirit. The final chapter begins with Winston in a coffee shop several years later. He's trying to solve a chess puzzle and sipping his drink. His face and body have begun their slow healing process. His teeth are being replaced from the dentist, but he still looks like a completely different person. His facial bones have been reconstructed. His skin color has changed. He's pale and sickly, skinny. His muscles have rotted. And most significantly, he doesn't feel like the same person. He has completely destroyed and betrayed everything that he cared about. He runs into Julia on the streets, and he feels nothing for her. In fact, he even feels some disgust at how changed and disfigured she is. After all, she went through the same torture that he did, and she feels the same way about him. They exchange some small talk one day when they happen to bump into each other at the bus stop. Julia confesses, "I betrayed you." And Winston says, "I betrayed you too." There's a long pause, and then Julia says, I thought they couldn't get inside you. I thought that I could confess and betray, and that it wouldn't be the real me." Another long pause. "I thought I wouldn't mean it." Winston understood. When he thought he could save himself by wishing pain on Julia, he truly wished pain on Julia in order to save himself. Julia said, "All you care about is yourself. And after that, you don't feel the same way towards the other person as you used to." Winston agreed. Both of them sat in uncomfortable silence in the gloomy, cold day. It seemed as though there was nothing else to say. They had both truly betrayed one another, and their love had been destroyed. They realized that they cared more about themselves than the other. They were animals. Julia said something about needing to catch a trolley and quickly left. Winston was glad to see her go. He had gotten his old job back, along with many of the people that he had worked with. And now, with tears in his eyes, he realized that he had won the conflict over himself. He had grown to love Big Brother. And that's how the book ends. Orwell has a very pessimistic view of human nature. He says, basically, that the human spirit can be molded and it can be broken, and that this is inevitable. I think the reason that Orwell is stuck with this kind of pessimism is because he has a worldview without Christ. He has a worldview without forgiveness, without redemption, without a love that is the rock bottom essence of reality, the love that redeems and the love that judges evil. One of the reasons I think human beings are so interested in utopias and dystopias is because we used to live in a utopia. We're built for utopia. And now we basically are always going to live in some type of dystopia. No matter what institutions that we build, no matter how we safeguard the best things in life, they're always corrupted. They always disintegrate. They always crumble. It's part of the curse. It's a part of the wages of sin. It's a part of the results of evil. And not only the evil that we do, but the evil that we want to do. And that's how 1984 ends. It ends with the final conclusion that it's not just that you have the potential of betraying your loved ones and betraying humanity and destroying your own human spirit. It's that given the right circumstances, you're basically guaranteed to. And not only are you guaranteed to, but you would want to. And that's something important about, I think, that's an important overlap about Orwell's view of human nature and I think the Christian view of human nature. The problem is not just that you do evil things, it's that you want to do evil things. Right? For Orwell, he's saying it's not just that you betrayed your loved ones and you betrayed the spirit of humanity, it's that you wanted to. It's that at the end of the day, you're still an animal. And when it comes to time to choose between freedom and happiness, you're going to choose happiness, no matter what. And that's why we will always be ruled by tyrants. That's why things will always degenerate. And in some sense, I think Orwell's right, except that he's missing the Christian hope. We'll talk more about that Christian hope and how that hope can actually reverse and regenerate a lot of our political institutions in the next episode. Thank you for listening to the Well-Read Christian Podcast.